Kate Morrison pulled her heavy coat tighter as she stepped out of her Ranger truck into the crisp December morning. The air was so cold it burned her lungs, and her breath formed thick clouds in front of her face. She had been a wildlife ranger for 8 years now, but the Wyoming winters still amazed her with their brutal beauty. She grabbed her clipboard and binoculars from the passenger seat, checking her watch. 7:30 in the morning, right on schedule. Kate had planned to complete her monthly wildlife count in the Stillwater Valley before noon, then head back to the ranger station for paperwork and a hot cup of coffee. It was supposed to be a routine day, the kind she had done hundreds of times before. The weather forecast that morning had been typical for December in Wyoming. Light snow, maybe 2 inches, with temperatures around 20 degrees. Nothing unusual for this time of year. Kate had dressed appropriately in her thick winter gear, packed her emergency kit, and made sure her radio was working. She followed all the safety protocols that had kept her safe during her years patrolling these remote mountains. As Kate walked along the frozen trail, she pulled out her binoculars to scan the valley below. The Stillwater Valley was one of her favorite places to work. It stretched for miles between 2 mountain ridges, covered in pine trees and dotted with frozen ponds. In the summer, it was green and full of wildlife. In winter, it looked like a Christmas card, all white and peaceful. Kate was looking for signs of the wild animals that called this valley home. Elk, deer, mountain lions, and bears all lived here, but she was especially interested in the wild Mustang horses that roamed freely through this area. The herd had been here for generations, tough survivors who knew how to live in harsh conditions. She had been walking for about an hour when she noticed the wind picking up. At first, it was just a gentle breeze that made the pine trees whisper. But within minutes, the wind grew stronger, howling through the valley like a freight train. Kate looked up at the sky and felt her stomach drop. The clear morning sky had disappeared. Dark, angry clouds were rolling in fast from the west, moving much faster than any weather system she had ever seen. These weren't the light snow clouds the Weather Service had predicted. These clouds looked dangerous, the kind that brought serious storms. Kate immediately reached for her radio. "Base, this is Ranger Morrison. I'm seeing some unexpected weather moving in. Can you give me an update?" Nothing but static came through the radio. Kate tried again, adjusting the frequency and checking the battery. Still nothing. The mountains sometimes interfered with radio signals, but her radio had been working fine just an hour ago. The first snowflakes started falling as Kate hurried back toward her truck. But these weren't the gentle flakes the forecast had promised. They were big, wet, heavy flakes that fell so fast she could barely see 10 feet in front of her. Within minutes, the light snowfall had turned into a wall of white. Kate quickened her pace. But the snow was falling so heavily that the trail was already disappearing under a blanket of white. The wind was getting stronger too, whipping the snow around so violently that it felt like being inside a washing machine. Kate had to squint and hold her hand up to shield her face from the stinging snow. By the time she reached her truck, Kate was breathing hard and covered in snow from head to toe. She brushed off her jacket and climbed into the driver's seat, grateful to be out of the wind. She turned the key and the engine started with a reassuring rumble. Kate tried the radio again, hoping the truck's more powerful antenna would help. "Base, this is Morrison. I'm caught in a major snowstorm in Stillwater Valley. The weather forecast was completely wrong. I'm heading back now." Still nothing but static. Kate felt the first real flutter of worry in her chest. Being caught in bad weather was one thing, but being caught without communication was much more serious. She put the truck in gear and started driving slowly down the mountain road. The snow was falling so fast that her windshield wipers could barely keep up. Kate had to lean forward and peer through the windshield, trying to follow the road that was rapidly disappearing under the snow. The wind was incredible now, rocking the heavy truck back and forth like it was a toy. Kate had driven in blizzards before, but this was different. This storm had come out of nowhere and was getting worse by the minute. She realized she was experiencing what meteorologists called a bomb cyclone, A storm that intensifies so rapidly it becomes dangerous in a matter of hours. Kate had only driven about 2 miles when disaster struck. A massive gust of wind hit the truck just as she was navigating a curve in the road. The truck skidded sideways on the snow-covered pavement, and before Kate could regain control, it slid off the road and crashed into a deep snowdrift. The engine died, and suddenly everything was quiet except for the howling wind outside. Kate tried to restart the truck, but the wheels just spun uselessly in the deep snow. She was stuck, and stuck badly. Kate grabbed her emergency pack from behind the seat and checked its contents. Flashlight, extra batteries, emergency food bars, a small first aid kit, matches, and a space blanket. It was the standard emergency kit that all Rangers carried, but it wasn't designed for an extended stay in a major blizzard. She tried the radio one more time, but the storm was interfering with all communications. Kate was on her own, 12 miles from the nearest ranger station. In a storm that was getting worse every minute, looking out the truck windows, Kate could see that the storm showed no signs of stopping. The snow was falling so heavily that she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The wind was howling like a living thing, and she could feel the truck shaking with each gust. Kate made a decision that would change her life forever. She couldn't stay in the truck. The road she was on was rarely used in winter, and no one would be looking for her until she failed to check in that evening. By then, the truck could be completely buried in snow. Her only option was to hike back to the ranger station. 12 miles in a blizzard was dangerous, but staying put might be deadly. Kate had good winter gear and knew the mountains well. If she stayed calm and followed the main trail, she could make it. Kate put on her warmest hat and gloves, shouldered her emergency pack, and stepped out of the truck into the storm. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet. Snow immediately began sticking to her clothes and face, and the cold was so intense it made her eyes water. She started walking, following what she thought was the trail back toward the ranger station. But within minutes, Kate realized she had made a terrible mistake. The snow was falling so heavily and the wind was so strong that she couldn't see any landmarks. The trail, the trees, even the shape of the mountains around her had disappeared into a world of swirling white. Kate Morrison, an experienced ranger who knew these mountains like her own backyard, was lost in one of the worst blizzards Wyoming had seen in decades. And the storm was just getting started. Kate had been walking for what felt like hours, though her frozen watch showed it had only been 45 minutes since she left the truck. Every step was a battle against the wind and snow. The storm had turned the familiar Stillwater Valley into an alien landscape where nothing looked the same. Her legs burned with exhaustion as she pushed through snow that was now knee-deep. With each step, her boots sank into the soft powder, and she had to use extra energy to pull her feet out for the next step. It was like walking through thick mud, except this mud was freezing cold and getting deeper by the minute. Kate stopped for a moment and tried to get her bearings. She pulled out her compass, but the needle was spinning wildly. The metal in her pack and the electrical activity of the storm were interfering with the magnetic reading. She couldn't trust it to point her in the right direction. Looking around, Kate realized she had no idea where she was. The swirling snow made it impossible to see more than 10 feet in any direction. The mountains that usually served as her landmarks had disappeared completely. Every direction looked exactly the same, just endless white snow and gray sky. "Okay, Kate, think," she said out loud, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "You know these mountains. The ranger station is northeast of where you parked. The main trail follows the valley floor." But as she looked around, Kate couldn't tell which direction was northeast anymore. The storm had completely disoriented her. She had been walking for almost an hour, but she could have been going in circles for all she knew. Kate's hands were starting to go numb despite her thick gloves. She flexed her fingers, trying to keep the blood flowing. She knew from her wilderness training that cold hands were one of the first signs that her body was losing the battle against hypothermia. The wind was getting stronger, and the temperature was dropping fast. Kate estimated it was now close to 0 degrees, maybe colder with the wind chill. Her face felt like it was being stabbed by 1,000 tiny needles every time the wind hit her. She needed to find shelter soon. Kate looked around desperately for anything that could protect her from the wind. A large tree, a rock outcropping, even a fallen log would help. But the storm made it impossible to see anything useful. Kate forced herself to keep walking, though her movements were becoming clumsy and uncoordinated. She stumbled over hidden rocks and struggled to maintain her balance in the deep snow. Her breathing was becoming labored, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. After another 30 minutes of walking, Kate's legs finally gave out. She fell forward into the snow, her hands disappearing completely into the white powder. For a moment, she just lay there, exhausted and defeated. The cold immediately began seeping through her clothes where the snow touched her body. "Get up," Kate told herself firmly. "You can't stop here." She knew from her survival training that lying down in the snow was often the last thing people did before they died of hypothermia. Kate pushed herself back to her feet, but her movements were slow and shaky. She was displaying the classic symptoms of mild hypothermia: confusion, fatigue, and loss of coordination. Her body temperature was dropping, and her mind wasn't working as clearly as it should. That's when she spotted something through the swirling snow. About 50 yards away, there appeared to be a dark shape against the white landscape. Kate squinted, trying to make out what it was. It looked like it might be a rock formation or maybe a small cliff face. Summoning her remaining strength, Kate pushed through the snow toward the dark shape. As she got closer, she realized it was a large boulder, maybe 8 feet tall, with a smaller rock leaning against it. The two rocks formed a small alcove that was partially protected from the wind. Kate practically fell into the small space between the rocks, grateful to be out of the direct assault of the wind and snow. The alcove wasn't perfect. Snow was still blowing in from the sides, but it was better than being completely exposed to the storm. She pulled out her space blanket from her emergency pack. The thin, metallic material was designed to reflect body heat back to the person wrapped in it. Kate wrapped the crinkly blanket around her shoulders and tried to huddle into as small a space as possible to conserve body heat, but even with the partial shelter and the space blanket, Kate could feel the cold creeping into her bones. Her feet was starting to go numb, and she was shivering uncontrollably. She knew these were warning signs that her body temperature was continuing to drop. Kate tried to eat one of her emergency food bars, but her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unwrap it. The bar was frozen solid, and when she tried to bite it, it nearly broke her teeth. She sucked on small pieces, trying to get some calories into her system to help her body generate heat. As the afternoon wore on, the storm showed no signs of stopping. If anything, it seemed to be getting worse. The wind was now so strong that it was creating a ground blizzard, picking up the snow that had already fallen and whipping it around like a tornado. Kate tried to stay awake and alert, but hypothermia was making her drowsy. She caught herself nodding off several times, and each time she forced herself to wake up and move around in the small space to keep her blood flowing. "Stay awake, Kate," she told herself. "People die when they fall asleep in the cold." But her body was shutting down to preserve her vital organs. Her heart rate was slowing, and her breathing was becoming shallow. Kate's body was entering the early stages of severe hypothermia, though her confused mind didn't fully understand what was happening. As darkness began to fall, Kate realized she was in serious trouble. She had been exposed to the storm for nearly 6 hours now, and her body was losing the fight against the cold. Her emergency shelter was barely adequate, and she didn't have enough food or warm clothing to survive a full night in these conditions. Kate tried her radio one more time, but all she got was static. Even if someone was looking for her, they would never find her in this storm. The snow was falling so heavily that any tracks she had made were erased within minutes. The temperature was dropping even more as night approached. Kate estimated it would go down to at least 15 below zero, maybe colder with the wind chill. Even healthy people with proper gear would struggle to survive a night like this. In her weakened condition, Kate wasn't sure she would see morning. She pulled the space blanket tighter around her body and tried to think positive thoughts. She thought about her fellow rangers back at the station, probably wondering why she hadn't checked in. She thought about her sister in Colorado, who would be devastated if something happened to Kate. But most of all, Kate thought about the wild Mustang horses that lived in this valley. She had spent years studying them and protecting them from those who wanted to remove them from their ancestral home. The horses had survived in these mountains for generations, enduring winters much worse than this one. If the Mustangs could survive in this wilderness, maybe she could too. Kate closed her eyes and tried to imagine their strength and resilience flowing into her own body. She would need every bit of that strength to make it through the long, cold night ahead. The storm continued to rage around her small shelter, and Kate Morrison prepared to fight for her life. As night fell over the Stillwater Valley, Kate's condition was getting worse by the hour. The small shelter between the rocks wasn't enough to protect her from the brutal cold. Snow kept blowing in through the gaps, and the wind seemed to find every opening in her clothing. Kate's shivering had become violent and uncontrollable. Her whole body shook so hard that her teeth chattered constantly, making it impossible to think clearly. She tried to wrap the space blanket tighter around herself, but her fingers were so numb she could barely feel the thin material. "Just make it through the night," Kate whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "Someone will come looking in the morning." But even as she said the words, Kate knew they weren't true. The storm was too severe for any rescue operation. Helicopters couldn't fly in these conditions, and ground teams wouldn't be able to move through the deep snow until the weather cleared. Kate tried to stay focused by going through her survival checklist mentally. Shelter, she had partial shelter. Water, she could melt snow, though doing so would use precious body heat. Food, she had a few energy bars left. Warmth, that was the problem. She was losing the battle against the cold. Around midnight, Kate made a decision that would nearly cost her life. The hypothermia was affecting her judgment, making her think in ways that didn't make sense. The small space between the rocks suddenly felt like a trap instead of a shelter. Her confused mind told her she needed to keep moving to stay warm. "I have to find better shelter," Kate said out loud, though her words were slurred and confused. "There has to be something better than this." Kate forced herself to stand up, though her legs were weak and unsteady. She had been sitting in the cold for hours, and her muscles had stiffened up. Every movement was painful, and she had to hold onto the rocks for support. She gathered her emergency pack and stepped out of the small shelter into the full force of the storm. The wind immediately knocked her sideways, and she had to grab the boulder to keep from falling. Snow pelted her face like tiny bullets, and the cold hit her like a physical blow. "This is better," Kate told herself, though it obviously wasn't. Her mind was no longer working properly. Severe hypothermia was setting in, and with it came the confusion and poor decision-making that had killed countless people in the wilderness. Kate started walking again, leaving behind the only shelter she had found. She stumbled through the deep snow with no clear direction or purpose. Her movements were clumsy and uncoordinated, like someone who had been drinking heavily. The snow was now up to her thighs in some places, making each step a tremendous effort. Kate would take a few steps forward, then have to stop and rest, breathing heavily in the thin mountain air. Her heart was working overtime to pump blood through her rapidly cooling body. After walking for about 20 minutes, Kate came to what looked like a small clearing. In the dim light filtering through the storm clouds, she could see the dark outline of trees surrounding an open space. In the middle of the clearing, she could make out what appeared to be a frozen creek bed. Kate's confused mind told her this might be a good place to rest. The trees would provide some protection from the wind, she thought. She stumbled toward the center of the clearing, her boots crunching through the crust of snow that had formed over the frozen creek. But Kate's legs were no longer obeying her commands properly. As she tried to step over a fallen log hidden beneath the snow, she lost her balance completely. Her feet went out from under her, and she fell forward face first into the deep snow. The impact knocked the wind out of her lungs, and for a moment Kate just lay there, gasping for breath. The snow was soft and deep where she had fallen, almost up to her waist as she lay on her side. She tried to push herself back up, but her arms had no strength left. "Get up, Kate," she told herself weakly. "You can't stay here." But her body wouldn't respond. The severe hypothermia had reached a critical stage. Kate's core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels, and her body was shutting down all non-essential functions to preserve her vital organs. Kate managed to roll onto her back, staring up at the dark sky where snow continued to fall steadily. The flakes landed on her face and didn't melt immediately, a bad sign that meant her skin temperature had dropped below freezing. She tried to call for help, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Help," she said weakly. "Someone help me." But there was no one to hear her. Kate was alone in the vast wilderness, miles from the nearest human being. The only sounds were the wind howling through the trees and the soft patter of snow falling on the frozen ground. Kate's eyelids were getting heavy. The cold that had been so painful before was starting to feel almost warm. This was another dangerous sign. When hypothermia victims started feeling warm, it usually meant their body was giving up the fight. "Stay awake," Kate mumbled to herself. But the words were getting harder to form. Her tongue felt thick and clumsy in her mouth. Kate tried to move her arms and legs, but they felt like they belonged to someone else. She could barely feel her hands and feet anymore. The snow around her was gradually getting deeper as the storm continued, slowly covering her legs and working its way up her body. She thought about her life, about all the things she wished she had done differently. Kate wished she had called her sister more often, wished she had taken that vacation to Hawaii she had been planning. She wished she had told her fellow Rangers how much their friendship meant to her, most of all, Kate thought. About the wild Mustang horses she had spent so many years protecting. She hoped someone else would continue her work when she was gone. The horses deserved to run free in these mountains, just as they had for generations. As Kate lay in the snow, slowly being buried by the continuing blizzard, she began to lose consciousness. Her breathing became shallow and slow. Her heart rate dropped to dangerous levels. Her body was entering the final stages of severe hypothermia. The snow continued to fall steadily, covering Kate's motionless form like a white blanket. Within an hour, only her face and part of her jacket were visible above the surface. The storm showed no signs of stopping, and soon even those would be hidden beneath the snow. Kate Morrison, an experienced ranger who had spent 8 years protecting the wilderness she loved, was disappearing into the very landscape she had tried so hard to preserve. Her body temperature continued to drop, and her breathing became so faint it was barely detectable. But Kate wasn't completely alone in the wilderness, though she didn't know it. The Stillwater Valley was home to creatures that had survived countless harsh winters. Animals whose instincts had been sharpened by generations of life in the mountains. Somewhere in the storm, a herd of wild Mustang horses was moving through their ancestral territory, seeking shelter from the blizzard. These horses had abilities that humans often underestimated: the ability to sense danger, to find safety, and sometimes to recognize when another living creature needed help. The wind carried many scents through the valley that night, but soon it would carry one that would catch the attention of the Mustang herd, the scent of a human being in distress, buried beneath the snow in their domain. The wild Mustang herd moved through the storm like ghosts in the night. 12 horses in total, they had been traveling for hours, searching for shelter from the blizzard that had trapped them in the high country. These horses had lived in the Stillwater Valley for generations, and their ancestors had survived winters far worse than this one. Leading the herd was a magnificent black stallion that the local rangers had nicknamed Thunder. He was 15 years old, in his prime, with muscles that rippled beneath his thick winter coat. Thunder had been born in these mountains and knew every trail, every shelter, every safe place where his family could wait out a storm. Behind Thunder moved the rest of the herd, Marais with their young colts, older horses who had survived many harsh winters, and younger stallions who looked to Thunder for guidance. They moved in a tight group, using their bodies to shield the smaller horses from the worst of the wind and snow. The lead mare was a beautiful paint horse with brown and white markings that looked like someone had splashed paint across her coat. The rangers called her Storm, a name that suited her perfectly as she moved through the blizzard with grace and confidence. Storm was Thunder's partner and the mother of 3 of the colts in the herd. Storm had an unusual gift, even among horses, known for their keen senses. She could detect things that other animals missed: changes in weather, the presence of predators, even the emotions of other creatures. Tonight, as the herd moved through the deep snow, Storm was picking up something that made her uneasy. The horses had been walking for hours, following the familiar paths they used when winter storms forced them to seek shelter. They were heading toward a grove of thick pine trees where they had weathered many previous storms. The trees would provide protection from the wind, and the horses could huddle together for warmth, but as they moved through the valley, Storm kept lifting her head and sniffing the air. Something wasn't right. Mixed in with the scents of snow and pine trees, she detected something else, something that didn't belong in their wilderness home. Thunder noticed Storm's behavior immediately. The 2 horses had been together for years, and he trusted her instincts completely. When Storm was worried about something, Thunder paid attention. He slowed the herd's pace and moved closer to his mate. Storm nickered softly to Thunder, a sound that was almost lost in the howling wind. In the complex language that horses use to communicate with each other, she was telling him that danger was near. Not the kind of danger that came from wolves or mountain lions, but something different. The scent Storm was detecting was human, but not the usual human smells that came from the ranger station or the occasional hikers who visited the valley. This smell was mixed with fear and something else that Storm's instincts recognized as distress. Thunder tested the air himself, his nostrils flaring as he tried to identify what Storm had detected. At first, all he could smell was the clean scent of fresh snow and the familiar odors of his herd. But then, carried on a gust of wind, he caught it too, the unmistakable scent of a human in trouble. The big stallion raised his head and looked around, trying to locate the source of the smell. His eyes, well adapted to seeing in low light, scanned the snow-covered landscape. Everything looked normal. Just the endless white of the blizzard and the dark shapes of trees bent under the weight of snow. But Storm was insistent. She moved away from the herd, following her nose toward a small clearing about 100 yards away. Thunder followed her, leaving the other horses to wait among a cluster of pine trees. The 2 lead horses moved carefully through the deep snow, their powerful legs carrying them through drifts that would have stopped smaller animals as they approached the clearing. Both horses could sense that something was very wrong. The scent of distress was getting stronger, and now they could detect something else. The faint smell of the special clothes that humans wore, mixed with the metallic scent of the tools they carried. Storm reached the edge of the clearing first, and what she found made her stop suddenly. In the middle of the open space, barely visible beneath a blanket of fresh snow, was a human shape. Only a small part of a dark jacket and a patch of pale skin were visible above the white surface. The paint mare approached cautiously, her ears pricked forward and her nostrils flaring. She had encountered humans before, mostly the friendly rangers who studied the herd from a distance. But she had never seen a human lying motionless in the snow like this. Thunder joined Storm at the edge of the clearing, and both horses stood perfectly still for several minutes, watching and listening. They could barely detect the faint rise and fall of breathing, so shallow it was almost invisible. The human was alive, but just barely. Most wild animals would have fled from this scene. The sight and smell of a potentially dying creature would trigger their instinct to run, to avoid whatever danger might have caused this situation. But horses are different from most animals. They have a capacity for empathy that scientists are only beginning to understand. Storm took a step closer to the buried figure, then another. Her hooves crunched softly in the snow as she approached what she now realized was a female human. The paint mare had raised several foals of her own, and something about the helpless figure triggered her maternal instincts. Thunder watched his mate carefully. If Storm sensed danger, she would signal him immediately, and both horses would retreat to safety. But Storm showed no signs of fear or alarm. Instead, She seemed curious and concerned about the human buried in the snow. The lead mare lowered her head until her muzzle was just inches from Kate's partially exposed face. She could feel the faint warmth of the human's breath and hear the shallow, irregular breathing that indicated severe distress. Storm had heard these same labored breaths from animals that were dying, and her instincts told her this human needed help immediately. Storm turned to Thunder and whinnied softly, a sound that carried clearly through the storm in the complex communication system that horses use. She was telling him what she had discovered and asking for his guidance. Should they help this human, or should they continue on to find shelter for their own herd? Thunder approached the buried figure and conducted his own investigation. He sniffed carefully at Kate's exposed skin and detected the scent of hypothermia, the same smell that came from animals that had been too long in the cold. The big stallion recognized the signs of a creature in the final stages of freezing to death. For several long minutes, the two horses stood over Kate's nearly buried form as if having a silent conversation about what to do next. The rest of the herd waited among the pine trees, occasionally calling out to their leaders with soft, nickering sounds that were quickly swallowed by the wind. Finally, Thunder made a decision that would change everything. Instead of turning away and leading his herd to safety, the black stallion began pawing at the snow around Kate's body. His powerful hooves cleared away the loose powder, exposing more of her jacket and arms. Storm immediately understood what Thunder was doing and joined in. The paint mare used her muzzle to push snow away from Kate's head and shoulders, being careful not to step on the helpless human. Working together, the two horses quickly cleared most of the snow that had been covering Kate's body, but clearing the snow was only the first step. Both horses could sense that the human was dying from the cold, and simply uncovering her wouldn't be enough to save her life. They needed to do something that no wild animal had ever been documented doing before. They needed to share their own body heat with a member of another species. Thunder looked back toward the herd waiting in the trees, then at Storm, then at the unconscious human lying in the snow at their feet. The big stallion was making calculations that went beyond simple animal instinct. He was deciding whether to risk the safety of his entire herd to help a single human being. Storm seemed to sense his hesitation and moved closer to Kate's motionless form. The paint mare lowered herself carefully to the ground, positioning her warm body alongside the human. She looked up at Thunder with an expression that seemed to say, "We can't leave her here to die." Thunder stood for a moment longer, torn between his responsibility to protect his herd and something deeper, an empathy that transcended species boundaries. The wind howled around them, and snow continued to fall steadily, covering everything in sight. Then the black stallion made his choice. He called out to the rest of the herd with a commanding whinny that cut through the storm like a knife. One by one, the other Mustangs emerged from their shelter among the pine trees and made their way through the deep snow toward their leaders. What happened next would challenge everything scientists thought they knew about wild animal behavior. When Thunder called to his herd, the response was immediate. One by one, the Mustangs emerged from their shelter among the pine trees and made their way through the deep snow toward their leaders. The horses moved with purpose, following their stallion's command even though they didn't yet understand what he was asking of them. The first to reach the clearing was an older mare, named Whisper by the rangers who sometimes observed the herd. She was Storm's mother, a wise horse who had lived through many harsh winters. Whisper approached cautiously, her ears forward as she tried to understand why. Thunder and Storm were standing over what appeared to be a human buried in the snow. Behind Whisper came the other mares, each accompanied by their foals who stayed close to their mother's sides. The younger horses were nervous about the unfamiliar situation, but they trusted their elders to keep them safe. A few of the teenage colts hung back at the edge of the clearing, ready to run if danger appeared. Thunder stood over Kate's motionless form and whinnied again, this time in a different tone. He was explaining to his herd what he had discovered and what he planned to do about it. The horses listened intently, their intelligent eyes focused on their leader as he communicated in the complex language of nickering, snorting, and body movements that horses use to share information. Storm was already lying on her side next to Kate, her warm body pressed against the human's left side. The Paint Moret's thick winter coat was designed to keep her comfortable in temperatures well below zero, and now she was sharing that warmth with a creature from another species entirely. What happened next was extraordinary, even by the standards of animal behavior that scientists thought they understood. Instead of fleeing from the unusual situation, the other horses began to position themselves around Kate's unconscious form. Thunder carefully lowered his massive body to the ground on Kate's right side, mirroring Storm's position. The big stallion was careful not to put his full weight on the human, using his powerful legs to support himself while still providing as much body heat as possible. His warm breath created small clouds in the frigid air as he settled into position. Whisper approached next, positioning herself near Kate's feet. The older Mare understood immediately what Thunder and Storm were trying to do. She had seen young foals suffering from cold, and she knew that sharing body heat was often the difference between life and death. Whisper lay down carefully, covering Kate's legs with her own warm body. The other Mares followed their elders' example. They formed a protective circle around the three horses who were directly warming Kate's body. The outer ring of horses served as a windbreak, using their large bodies to block the worst of the storm from reaching the human in the center. The scene was unlike anything ever documented in the wild. 12 horses, each weighing between 800 and 1,200 pounds, had arranged themselves into a living shelter designed to save the life of a human being. They worked together with a coordination that suggested they understood exactly what they were doing. The foals, initially confused by their mother's behavior, soon understood that this was important. The young horses positioned themselves between the adult horses, adding their smaller bodies to the collective effort to create warmth and block the wind. Even the teenage colts, who had been hesitant at first, moved closer to join the protective formation. As the hours passed, the horses maintained their positions with remarkable discipline. They took turns standing guard, with one or two horses remaining alert for predators while the others focused on keeping Kate warm. When one horse grew tired or cold, another would carefully take its place without disturbing the human they were protecting. Storm and Thunder never left their positions directly beside Kate. The two lead horses seemed to understand that the human's survival depended on maintaining constant body heat. Storm occasionally lifted her head to nuzzle Kate's face gently, as if checking to see if the human was still breathing. The horse's behavior was driven by something deeper than simple animal instinct. Research has shown that horses are capable of extraordinary empathy, able to sense the emotions and physical state of other creatures. Some scientists believe that horses can actually detect changes in heart rate and breathing patterns, allowing them to recognize when another being is in distress. Throughout the long night, Kate's body temperature slowly began to stabilize. The combined warmth from 12 large animals was gradually counteracting the effects of severe hypothermia. The horses' body heat, combined with their protection from the wind, created a microclimate around Kate that was significantly warmer than the surrounding air. The Mustangs seemed to understand that they were fighting against time. Hypothermia is a relentless killer, and every minute that Kate's body temperature remained dangerously low increased the risk of permanent damage or death. The horses maintained their vigil with the patience and determination of medical professionals working to save a patient's life. Around midnight, Kate stirred slightly for the first time since the horses had found her. Her breathing became a little stronger, and she made a small sound, barely more than a whisper, but enough to catch Storm's attention. The Paint Mare lifted her head and looked down at the human with what could only be described as concern. Thunder felt the slight movement too and adjusted his position to provide even more warmth. The big stallion seemed to understand that any sign of life from the human was progress worth protecting. He settled more firmly against Kate's side, sharing as much of his body heat as possible. The other horses sensed the change in their leader's behavior and responded accordingly. The outer circle moved slightly closer, tightening their protective formation. Whisper pressed more firmly against Kate's legs, and the mares on the windward side of the circle stood taller to block more of the storm. As the night wore on, the storm began to show signs of weakening. The wind wasn't quite as fierce, and the snow wasn't falling as heavily, but the temperature remained brutally cold, and the horses knew their work wasn't finished. They maintained their protective formation hour after hour, never wavering in their commitment to keeping the human alive. The horses didn't know Kate's name or understand her role as a ranger who had spent years protecting their herd. They didn't know that she had fought against those who wanted to remove wild Mustangs from their ancestral lands, or that she had dedicated her career to ensuring their freedom. All they knew was that a living creature needed help, and they had the power to provide it. Around 3 in the morning, Kate stirred again, this time more noticeably. Her eyelids fluttered, and she made a soft moaning sound. The horses immediately sensed the change, and several of them lifted their heads to look at the human who was slowly beginning to return to consciousness. Storm whinnied softly, a gentle sound that seemed designed to comfort rather than alarm. The paint mare had raised several foals, and she used the same soothing tone with Kate that she had used with her own babies when they were frightened or hurt. Kate's eyes opened briefly, but she was still too weak and confused to understand what was happening. All she could sense was warmth and safety, a feeling that was completely unexpected given her dire situation just hours before. Her mind was still clouded by hypothermia, but some part of her subconscious recognized that she was no longer alone in the wilderness. The horses continued their vigil as dawn approached, never leaving their protective positions around the human who had become their unexpected responsibility. They had transformed from a herd of wild animals into a rescue team, working together to save a life in a display of interspecies cooperation that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about animal behavior. As the first gray light of morning began to filter through the storm clouds, Kate Morrison was still alive, and it was entirely due to the extraordinary compassion of 12 wild Mustang horses, who had refused to let her die alone in the snow. The first thing Kate noticed when she slowly began to wake up was warmth. For someone who had been dying of hypothermia just hours before, the sensation was almost overwhelming. Her body felt heavy and stiff, but she was definitely warm. The second thing she noticed was that she wasn't alone. Kate's eyes opened slowly, her vision blurry and unfocused. At first, all she could see were dark shapes surrounding her, and she wondered if she was dreaming or hallucinating. People with severe hypothermia often experienced confusion and strange visions as their brains began working again, but as her vision cleared, Kate realized the dark shapes around her were not hallucinations. They were horses. Wild Mustang horses, lying on the ground around her like living blankets. Their large bodies were pressed close to hers, and she could feel their steady breathing and the incredible warmth radiating from their thick winter coats. Kate tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't obey her commands. Her muscles felt like they belonged to someone else, and her movements were slow and clumsy. The horses noticed her stirring immediately, and several of them lifted their heads to look at her with calm, intelligent eyes. What? Kate tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. Her throat was dry and scratchy, and her tongue felt thick in her mouth. She tried again. How is this possible? Storm, the paint mare who had been lying closest to Kate's head, lifted herself carefully and moved a few feet away. The horse's movement was slow and deliberate, as if she understood that sudden actions might frighten the confused human. Storm stood quietly, watching Kate with an expression that seemed almost concerned. Thunder remained lying against Kate's right side, his massive body still providing crucial warmth. The big stallion turned his head to look at Kate, and for a moment, human and horse stared directly into each other's eyes. Kate had looked into the eyes of many wild animals during her years as a ranger, but she had never seen anything quite like the intelligence and compassion she saw in Thunder's gaze. "You saved my life," Kate whispered, the words coming out with wonder and disbelief. "You actually saved my life?" As Kate became more alert, she began to assess her condition with the training that had kept her alive in dangerous situations before. Her fingers and toes were numb, and when she tried to wiggle them, sharp pains shot through her hands and feet. That was actually a good sign. It meant she still had feeling in her extremities, which suggested the frostbite might not be too severe. Her legs felt like blocks of ice, and when she tried to move them, the muscles cramped painfully. Kate realized she was probably dealing with moderate to severe frostbite in her feet and hands, but the horse's warmth had prevented the hypothermia from killing her. "I need to get to help," Kate said out loud, though she was really talking to herself. "But how am I going to walk?" As if understanding her dilemma, Thunder remained pressed against her side while the other horses began to move. They didn't leave. Instead, they repositioned themselves around Kate in a way that would allow her to sit up while still providing support and warmth. Kate managed to push herself into a sitting position, though the effort left her breathing heavily. The world spun around her for a moment, and she had to close her eyes until the dizziness passed. When she opened them again, she found herself looking out over a winter landscape that was both beautiful and terrifying. The storm had finally stopped, and the morning sun was beginning to break through the clouds. Everything was covered in fresh snow that sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. But Kate knew that the peaceful beauty was deceptive. She was still miles from help, and her condition was still critical. Kate pulled off her gloves and looked at her hands. Her fingers were white and waxy-looking, clear signs of frostbite. When she pressed on her fingernails, they turned white and stayed white instead of returning to pink immediately. That meant the frostbite was serious, but probably not severe enough to require amputation if she could get medical help soon. Her feet were worse. Even through her thick boots, Kate could tell that her toes were badly frostbitten. She couldn't feel them at all, and when she tried to move her feet, the pain was excruciating. Kate realized that even if she could stand up, walking any significant distance would be nearly impossible. "I'm in trouble," Kate said quietly, looking around at the horses who were still watching her carefully. "I don't know how I'm going to get out of here." Thunder seemed to understand that the human was still in distress. The big stallion stood up slowly, shaking the snow off his black coat. He took a few steps away from Kate, then turned back to look at her with an expression that seemed almost expectant. Storm joined Thunder, and both horses stood side by side about 10 feet away from where Kate sat in the snow. The two lead horses began making soft nickering sounds, as if they were trying to communicate something important to the confused human. Kate watched the horses with growing amazement. In her 8 years as a ranger, she had observed countless animals in the wild, but she had never seen behavior quite like this. The horses weren't just acting on instinct. They seemed to be thinking, planning, trying to solve the problem of how to help her. "You want me to come with you," Kate said, sudden understanding flooding through her. "You know where to go, don't you?" Thunder whinnied softly and took another step in the direction that Kate somehow knew led toward the ranger station. The stallion looked back at her again, and this time his meaning was unmistakable. He was offering to guide her to safety, but Kate knew she couldn't walk that far. Her frostbitten feet would never carry her the miles she needed to travel. Even with the horse's help, she would probably collapse long before reaching help. That's when Thunder did something that made Kate's heart skip a beat. The big stallion approached her slowly, then carefully lowered himself to the ground right beside her. He lay down in a position that would allow Kate to use his body for support, maybe even to lean against him as she tried to walk. Storm immediately understood what Thunder was offering and positioned herself on Kate's other side. The Paint Mare also lowered herself to the ground, creating a living support system that might allow the injured human to move. Kate stared at the two horses in amazement. They were offering to help her walk, to support her weight as she struggled toward safety. It was an act of interspecies cooperation that seemed impossible, yet it was happening right in front of her eyes. "I can't believe this," Kate whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "I can't believe you're doing this for me." With tremendous effort, Kate managed to position herself between the two horses. Thunder and Storm stood up slowly and carefully, allowing Kate to use their bodies for support as she struggled to her feet. Her legs shook with weakness, and the pain in her frostbitten feet was overwhelming. But she was standing. The other horses in the herd seemed to understand what was happening. They formed a loose circle around Kate, Thunder, and Storm, creating a protective escort that would shield the injured human from the wind as they traveled. Kate took her first tentative step, leaning heavily on Thunder for support. The pain was incredible, but she was moving. With Storm on one side and Thunder on the other, she might actually be able to make the journey to safety. "Okay," Kate said, her voice stronger now despite the pain. "Let's go home." As the unusual group began their slow journey across the snow-covered landscape, Kate realized she was witnessing something that would change everything scientists thought they knew about wild horses. But more than that, she was experiencing firsthand the incredible power of compassion that transcended the boundaries between species. The Mustangs had not only saved her life, they were now risking their own safety to guide her home. The journey began slowly, with Kate taking tiny, painful steps through the deep snow. Thunder walked on her right side, his powerful shoulder providing a solid support for her to lean against. Storm matched their pace on the left, ready to catch Kate if she stumbled or fell. The Paint Moret's steady presence gave Kate the confidence to keep moving forward. Every step was agony. Kate's frostbitten feet felt like they were being stabbed with thousands of needles. The cold had damaged the nerves in her toes, and now that circulation was returning, the pain was almost unbearable. But Kate gritted her teeth and forced herself to keep walking. She knew that stopping meant death. The other horses in the herd spread out around them, creating a protective formation that Kate had never seen in wild animals before. Two young stallions moved ahead of the group, breaking trail through the deepest snow and checking for obstacles. The Morets with foals stayed close to the center, while the older horses brought up the rear, watching for any signs of danger. "This is incredible," Kate whispered to Thunder as they walked. "You're acting like a trained rescue team." Thunder's ear twitched at the sound of her voice, and he turned his head slightly to look at her. The big stallion seemed to understand that the human needed encouragement, and he nickered softly in response. After walking for about 20 minutes, Kate's strength began to fail. Her legs were shaking with exhaustion, and she was breathing heavily in the thin mountain air. The combination of hypothermia recovery and the physical effort of walking through deep snow was taking a tremendous toll on her body. Kate stumbled, and would have fallen if Storm hadn't immediately pressed closer, using her body to keep the human upright. "I need to rest," Kate gasped, her voice barely audible over her labored breathing. Thunder seemed to understand immediately. The stallion stopped walking and carefully lowered himself to the ground, creating a warm resting place for Kate in the snow. Storm positioned herself as a windbreak while Kate collapsed against Thunder's side. Grateful for the chance to catch her breath, the other horses formed a protective circle around them, just as they had done during the night. But now their formation was different. They were positioned to watch for threats, while their leaders cared for the injured human. Several horses kept their heads high, scanning the landscape for predators that might be attracted by the scent. Of weakness, Kate rested for about 10 minutes, feeling her strength slowly return. Thunder's body heat helped warm her core temperature, and Storm occasionally nuzzled her gently, as if checking to make sure she was still conscious and alert. "I'm okay," Kate told the horses, though she wasn't sure they understood her words. "I can keep going." When Kate was ready to continue, Thunder and Storm helped her stand again. This time, the horses seemed to have developed an even better system for supporting her weight. Thunder positioned himself so that Kate could wrap her arm around his neck, while Storm walked so close that Kate's left side was constantly pressed against the Mare's warm flank. The journey continued across the snow-covered valley, with the unusual procession moving at a pace determined entirely by Kate's ability to walk. The horses showed infinite patience, stopping whenever Kate needed to rest and adjusting their speed to match her slow, painful steps. As they traveled, Kate began to recognize landmarks that told her they were heading in the right direction. There was the distinctive rocky outcrop that she had used as a navigation point many times before. There was the old lightning-struck pine tree that marked the halfway point between her truck and the ranger station. "You know exactly where you're going," Kate said with amazement. You've been watching us rangers all these years, learning our routes. The horses had indeed been observing human activity in their territory for generations. They knew where the ranger station was located, knew the trails that humans used, and understood which paths led to safety. Now they were using that knowledge to save the life of a human, who had spent years protecting their freedom. About 2 hours into their journey, Kate heard a sound that made her heart leap with hope, the distant whir of helicopter rotors. She looked up at the clear blue sky and saw a small aircraft moving across the valley, obviously searching for something. "That's for me," Kate said excitedly. "They're looking for me." Kate tried to wave at the helicopter, but her movements were weak, and the aircraft was too far away to see her small figure among the group of horses. The helicopter continued its search pattern, moving away from their location. Thunder seemed to understand what the flying machine meant. The stallion raised his head and let out a loud, piercing whinny that echoed across the valley. The other horses joined in, creating a chorus of calls that carried much farther than any sound Kate could make. The helicopter pilot heard the unusual sound of multiple horses calling together and turned the aircraft toward the noise. Within minutes, the helicopter was circling overhead, and Kate could see the amazed faces of the crew looking down at the incredible scene below. A ranger and a paramedic were hanging out of the helicopter, watching in disbelief as a group of wild Mustangs escorted an injured human across the snow. They had been searching for Kate for hours, but nothing had prepared them for what they were seeing now. The helicopter couldn't land in the deep snow where Kate and the horses were located, but the crew spotted a clearing about half a mile away that looked suitable for landing. The aircraft moved toward the clearing, and Kate knew that rescue was finally within reach, but there was still the problem of getting Kate to the landing zone. Her strength was almost completely gone, and half a mile might as well have been 50 miles given her condition. Once again, the horses seemed to understand exactly what needed to happen. Thunder and Storm positioned themselves even more closely on either side of Kate, practically carrying her as they continued toward the clearing. The other horses maintained their protective formation, creating a living stretcher that supported Kate's weight. The final part of the journey was the most difficult. Kate's vision was starting to blur, and she was having trouble staying conscious. The combination of exhaustion, pain, and the lingering effects of hypothermia was overwhelming her system, but every time Kate felt herself starting to collapse, Thunder would adjust his position to provide more support, or Storm would nuzzle her gently to keep her awake. The horses seemed to know instinctively that losing consciousness now could be fatal. As they approached the clearing where the helicopter had landed, Kate could see the rescue crew waiting with medical equipment and warm blankets. The paramedic was standing ready with a stretcher, and she could see the relief on their faces as the unusual procession emerged from the trees. "Almost there," Kate whispered to Thunder and Storm. "We almost made it." The horses had carried her across miles of difficult terrain, supporting her weight and guiding her to safety through a journey that should have been impossible. They had transformed from a herd of wild animals into the most effective rescue Team Kate had ever encountered. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Kate felt tears streaming down her face. She was going to survive, and it was entirely because 12 wild Mustang horses had refused to let her die alone in the wilderness. The most extraordinary rescue in the history of wildlife management was almost complete. The rescue crew stood in stunned silence as they watched the most extraordinary sight of their careers unfold before them. Kate Morrison, the missing ranger they had been searching for all night, was walking across the snowy clearing supported by 2 wild Mustang horses. Behind them, an entire herd of Mustangs followed in perfect formation, as if they were part of an organized rescue operation. Dr. Rodriguez, the paramedic who had been flying rescue missions for 15 years, had never seen anything like it. "This is impossible," he whispered to his partner. "Wild horses don't do this, they just don't." But impossible or not, it was happening right in front of them. Thunder and Storm walked steadily toward the rescue team, supporting Kate between them with careful, deliberate movements. The other horses maintained their protective circle, alert for any threat that might endanger the human they had spent the night saving. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Kate's legs finally gave out completely. She would have collapsed face first into the snow, but Thunder immediately lowered himself to the ground, creating a soft landing for the exhausted ranger. Storm positioned herself to block the wind while the rescue team rushed forward with their medical equipment. Kate, can you hear me?" Dr. Rodriguez called as he knelt beside her in the snow. He began checking her vital signs while his partner prepared warming blankets and 4 fluids. "I'm okay," Kate whispered, though she clearly wasn't. Her lips were blue, her skin was pale and waxy, and she was shivering uncontrollably. "The horses... they saved my life. They kept me warm all night." Dr. Rodriguez looked up at Thunder, who was still lying protectively beside Kate. The big stallion watched the medical procedures with calm intelligence, as if he understood that these humans were there to help. "I've never seen anything like this," the paramedic said softly. "These horses acted like they were part of our rescue team." As the medical team worked to stabilize Kate, the pilot of the helicopter contacted the ranger station to report what he was seeing. "Base, this is Rescue 1. We found Kate Morrison, and you're not going to believe this story. She's been rescued by a herd of wild Mustangs. I repeat, the horses rescued her." The radio crackled with disbelief from the other end. "Say again, Rescue 1. Did you say horses rescued her?" "That's correct, Base. 12 wild Mustangs guided her to our landing zone. They've been supporting her weight and keeping her warm. It's the most incredible thing I've ever witnessed." While the adults focused on medical procedures and radio communications, something beautiful was happening between Kate and the horses. Storm had moved closer and was gently nuzzling Kate's face as if saying goodbye. Kate reached up with her good hand and touched the Paint Moret's soft muzzle. "Thank you," Kate whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Thunder stood up slowly and approached Kate one last time. The big stallion lowered his massive head until it was just inches from Kate's face. For a long moment, human and horse looked directly into each other's eyes, sharing a connection that went beyond species, beyond words, beyond anything the watching humans had ever witnessed. "I'll never forget what you did for me," Kate told. "Thunder, never." The stallion seemed to understand. He lifted his head and whinnied softly, a sound that was answered by every horse in the herd. Then, as if following some invisible signal, the Mustangs began to move away from the clearing, but they didn't run. Instead, they walked slowly and deliberately, pausing at the edge of the tree line to look back at Kate one final time. Storm was the last to leave, standing at the forest's edge until the helicopter lifted off with Kate safely aboard. During the flight to the hospital, Kate insisted on telling the rescue crew everything that had happened. Dr. Rodriguez documented every detail, knowing that this story would change how people thought about wild horses forever. "They didn't just find me by accident," Kate explained, her voice growing stronger as the helicopter's heaters warmed her body. "They made a conscious decision to help me. They worked together like a team, taking shifts to keep me warm, positioning themselves to block the wind. And when it was time to get me to safety, they supported my weight and guided me to you." At the hospital, Kate's condition was diagnosed as severe hypothermia with moderate frostbite to her hands and feet. The doctors said that without the horses' intervention, she would have died within hours of collapsing in the snow. The Mustangs had literally saved her life by sharing their body heat during the critical hours when her core temperature was dropping to fatal levels. Kate spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from her ordeal. During that time, her story spread around the world. News crews from major networks came to interview her, and scientists from universities across the country contacted her to learn more about the horse's behavior. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, an animal behavior specialist from Colorado State University, was particularly interested in what Kate had experienced. "This represents one of the most extraordinary examples of interspecies cooperation ever documented," Dr. Walsh explained to a gathering of reporters. "These horses demonstrated not only empathy, but complex problem-solving skills and organized group behavior that we rarely see even in domestic animals." Kate lost 2 toes to frostbite, but she considered it a small price to pay for her life. When she was finally released from the hospital, the first thing she did was return to the Stillwater Valley to look for the herd that had saved her. She found them grazing peacefully in a meadow about 3 miles from where they had rescued her. As Kate approached on foot, moving slowly on her still healing feet, the horses looked up from their grazing. For a moment, she worried they might run away, treating her like any other human intruder, but Thunder and Storm recognized her immediately. The 2 horses approached Kate without fear, allowing her to touch them and speak to them softly. The other horses in the herd watched curiously but calmly, as if they too remembered the night they had worked together to save a human life. Kate's experience led to immediate changes in how the Stillwater Valley Mustangs were protected. The Bureau of Land Management, which had been considering relocating the herd, instead designated the entire valley as a permanent Mustang sanctuary. Kate's story had shown the world that these horses possessed intelligence and empathy that deserved protection and respect. Kate returned to her job as a ranger, but with a new mission. She became the leading advocate for Mustang protection in the region, using her incredible story to educate people about the intelligence and emotional capacity of wild horses. She gave speeches at schools, universities, and conservation conferences, always emphasizing that the horses hadn't saved her because she was special, they had saved her because they were special. Every month, Kate returned to visit the herd in Stillwater Valley. Thunder and Storm always approached her, as if maintaining a friendship that had been forged in the most desperate circumstances. The other horses seemed to remember her too, accepting her presence in their territory in a way they accepted no other human. Kate's story became one of the most documented cases of animal heroism in modern history. It challenged everything scientists thought they knew about wild horse behavior, and proved that the bond between humans and animals could transcend even the boundaries of species survival. But for Kate, the most important part of her story wasn't the scientific recognition or the media attention. It was the knowledge that when she was alone and dying in the wilderness, 12 wild horses had chosen compassion over self-preservation. They had risked their own safety to save a human being, creating a bond of trust and friendship that would last for the rest of Kate's life. The Mustangs of Stillwater Valley had not only saved Kate Morrison's life, they had shown the world the true meaning of compassion.